they both groups cooperate and end up being practically the same over time? Because the resources are limited and they have to survive. And
well, life is not a zero-sum game, and so the answer that I'm looking for, but with the best of reasons, is that, and let me just sum it up in more abstract terms, that there seems to be something inherently vulnerable about virtue. The traits that we associate with virtue seem inherently vulnerable to the traits that we associate with evil. But it is just as fundamental, that the traits that we associate with virtue are adaptive at the societal level, at the group level, compared to the traits that we associate with selfishness. And life is not a zero-sum game. So given the resources that we have, the traits that we associate with virtue, we're going to make the most of those. They're going to sustain them, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas the traits that we associate with evil are going to exploit them, deplete them, and so on. So it's not the case that there's going to be equivalence. So this is the point that I'm prepared to make, that I'm trying to make with my fanciful example, but which I'm prepared to make in a more formal sense, in terms of just thinking about these traits that we associate as good and evil. Well, let me proceed here, because although I do acknowledge that your answers are actually more interesting than the ones I'm looking for, because they do introduce many of the complications that we need to introduce in order to reflect the full diversity of human behavior, basically. Okay, so the good group will work together to escape the island or turn it into a little paradise, while the evil group will self-destruct. Third thought experiment. What will happen if you allow an evil individual to paddle over to Virtue Island? So the answer to this question actually is not straightforward, because it's a messy combination of the relatively straightforward answers to the first two questions. So simple but profound. The message of this exercise is that the traits associated with goodness can evolve by a purely Darwinian process, at least when appropriate conditions are met. So it is not the case that evolution explains selfishness well and altruism poorly. It can explain selfishness or altruism, the full spectrum, but altruism only evolves when certain conditions are met. Virtue is indeed vulnerable to exploitation within groups, but groups of virtuous individuals are likely to survive and reproduce better than any other kind of group. And the outcome of evolution depends on the balance between these two opposing forces. What I've tried to do in the quickest possible way is to introduce you to what in formal terms is called multi-level selection theory. And a review, a proper scientific review, is here with my article with Ed Wilson, Rethinking the Theoretical Foundation of Sociobiology. A condensed version was published in the New Scientist called Survival of the Selfless. And you can access both of those journals. Just type my name into Google, David Sloan Wilson into Google. You'll quickly get to my website, and those and other publications are available on my website. So there's a lot of science behind my little fanciful experiments here. And so what this does is to turn evolutionary theory from a threat to a useful tool. Rather than posing a threat to the concept of morality, such that if we believe in evolution, then life will become morally precarious, what this does is it enables us to identify the factors that can cause the behaviors associated with morality to flourish, okay, in places where you might never expect, like chickens. All this time you thought I was talking about humans. But here is a wonderful experiment on chickens, which those of you who've read my book know about. But so William Muir, a poultry scientist, where else? Purdue University. Selected for egg productivity in two different ways. And when I say poultry scientist, don't think of someone in a straw hat and dungarees. These are very, very sophisticated scientists. Now, chickens have always lived in groups, flocks. Nowadays, I'm sorry to report that they live in cages. And so both of these experiments involved many cages of hens. In experiment number one, Muir selected the best individual egg layer in each cage to breed the next generation of hens. And in experiment two, he picked the best cages, and he bred all of the hens in those cages. Now, these might seem like similar experiments, and it might seem that the first experiment would work better, because after all, it's individuals that lay eggs. Why don't you just select the best individual egg layers? Wouldn't that be more efficient? But the results told a completely different story. This is the actual result of the first experiment after 6 generations. Okay, and what we see here are not 9 chickens, but 3, because the other 6 have been murdered. And these chickens, these hens have become so aggressive that they plucked each other in their incessant attacks on themselves. And egg productivity is plummeted even though you selected the most productive hen each and every generation. So what happened? The most productive hens achieved their productivity by suppressing the productivity of all the other hens in the cage. You had selected for aggressive behavior, and after only 6 generations, you had produced a nation of psychopaths. So this is the result, and this is the equivalent of the first desert island experiment. Okay, what this is doing is it's revealing the evolutionary advantage of selfishness within a single group. Okay, the vulnerability of cooperation and the advantages of selfishness as far as local within group processes are concerned. The inherent vulnerability of prosociality and the other traits that we associate with virtue. Here is the result of the between group selection experiment. All 9 chickens are present, all fully feathered, and they look like they're having a good time as far as I can tell. These are your Mr. Rogers chickens. They want to be your neighbor. And so by selecting the best groups, you're selecting for traits that not only enable you to be a good egg layer, but also facilitate the egg layer of other members of the group. And I think this is so interesting for a number of reasons. One of which is, what is an individual trait anyhow? When we see something and we associate that with the way an individual is that really an individual trait? Or is that a product of social interactions which have been operating over the lifetime? And this has huge consequences for human development. I have research which I will not be telling you about, but I'm happy to show you, based on our studies of our own city, in which this basic principle applies, that when you look at the individuals who are thriving as individuals, that is because, guess what? They have been nurtured by multiple sources, family, neighborhoods, schools, and it's that which causes them not only to be thriving as individuals, but themselves to be pro-social. And so there's much to say about that. This chicken experiment speaks volumes. Well, I gave this talk now a number of years ago, and the professor ran up to me right afterwards, and she said, "That first experiment describes my department." So evidently, her department had adopted a policy which had rewarded its members purely for their individual accomplishments. And the result was comparable to the first chicken experiment. Now, genetic evolution had not taken place, but something comparable had taken place. And once again, I'm trying to communicate things which, in the fastest way I know how, but which also have can be also stated formally. So formally, in game theory terms, this is called the replicator dynamics. So if you're a game theorist, basically what you're saying is that any process that by which the most successful behavioral strategy increases in frequency and time, the most successful strategy becomes more common, counts as an evolutionary process. That includes genetic evolution. Okay, in genetic evolution, the most successful behaviors, when they're heritable, become more common over time. Okay, but it can also include learning, imitation, intentional thought, processes of cultural evolution. All of these will give you the same basic outcome. They all count as evolutionary processes. And what that means is it expands the domain of evolutionary theory beyond genetic evolution, which is where we usually think of it, to include these other fast-paced processes, as I will elaborate in a little bit. So